Today is the 15th of February. It's especially significant that this series is held today. Today also marks the 77th year to the day of the fall of Singapore during World War II. Every year, we mark this day called Total Defense Day because it is a stark reminder of what could happen to us again if we are unable to take care of our own defense. For our overseas friends who may not be as familiar with the concept of total defense, it was established in the 1980s as a framework for an all-round response to threats and challenges involving Singaporeans in the 5 main pillars of defense. Excuse me, namely military, civil, economic, social, and psychological. For Singapore, as a small country, I will add 2 other points. Excuse me. If ever we need to go into war or operations, there is no such thing as a partial war. There is only total. Because everybody in Singapore will be involved. And because of that, for us, defense must similarly be total. There is no such thing in Singapore as some parts of us can be in operations and the rest of us can continue to live life normally. The second aspect of total defense that we always remind ourselves is this. For the last 700 years, if not more, this place that we call home has either never been independent, never been able to be independent, or never been allowed to be independent. And I'll come back to this later. But this is something I always remind myself in public service. We have never been independent, never been able to be independent, or never been allowed to be independent. To better appreciate the total defense concept, we can go back to the history of this region and how we came about. With our history and background, Singapore is always easily a place for the contest for bigger powers. Singapore was founded by the British in 1819 because they needed another port of call in this region to refit and protect their merchant fleet, as well as to forestall any advance by the Dutch in what they call the East Indies. In a way, the founding of modern Singapore was a result of wider Anglo-Dutch competition. We were a piece on the global chessboard. Even before that, the Portuguese and the Dutch had in earlier centuries recognized the strategic importance of this little island, but for various reasons, they did not or could not fortify their positions here. If we go back further in history, Singapore would, through the various centuries, have been caught in the struggles between the competing empires of Southeast Asia. You can go back to Srivijaya, Majapahit, Palembang, Malacca, and so forth. During the Second World War, Singapore was targeted by the Japanese as they needed to eliminate opposition from the British base here and to maintain their fleet activities in the Pacific. The Japanese needed to protect their trade and communication lines, and Singapore was again a collateral in the war. Today, here in Singapore, it continues to be a place for contests. But we are now facing an even wider range of challenges and threats than ever before. Besides military actions, enemies can attack Singapore through other means, destroying our economy and economic systems, targeting our social fabric, or even targeting our fundamental beliefs and commitment. And the terrain has changed. In the past, we have to deal with what I call the 3-dimensional terrain: air, land, and sea. But today, the contests for power and influence extend beyond the physical three-dimensional domains. And this is one of the reasons why we have added a sixth pillar to our total defense concept this year. So the threats are becoming increasingly sophisticated, complex, and multifaceted. External players can try to secure their interests with any one of the dimensions of power, doing so through economic, cultural, information, or diplomatic means as well. This is not new to all the military practitioners. All dimensions of powers will be exercised to secure the respective country's interests: diplomatic, informational, military, economic, and any other thing that you can think of. This is not new. This has always been in the history of contests between nations. Our multi-ethnic and multicultural ancestries mean that we will always be subjected to attempts to influence and control our domestic agenda. They can come in the form of incentives, especially with the promise of short-term returns. They can come in the form of threats to make us afraid or to make us waver. Yet at other times, they can take the form of dividing and trying to divide Singaporeans and our society to the benefit of the foreign players. And for a small country with relatively little history, this is always a vulnerability. Today, all these are compounded by the pervasive use of the internet and social media. Such attacks can come through the cyberspace, and such attacks can be the norm even in what we call peacetime. Cyberspace provides a new, easy, and affordable channel, spreading new content to masses at far greater speed. The impact of messages or content sharing through these ubiquitous smartphones must never be underestimated. The speed which such messages can travel can again never be underestimated. And there is an asymmetry in human psychology. Good news travel slower than bad news. Straightforward stories are far less popular than other stories. As Lim Swee Say would say, dog bite man is not news. Man bite dog is news. The speed which they travel is vastly different. The way people receive the news is vastly different. And the impact is also vastly different. So the question is this: is total defense as a concept still relevant to us today? Is it still useful for us in an increasingly dynamic security environment shaped by disruptive technologies and multiple interested parties from state to non-state? So the answer is quite obvious. Total defense as a concept is more relevant than ever before. But just as we must keep up with the times, we must understand the changing terrain. The concept of total defense must similarly evolve with the times for it to remain relevant. And we, as a small country, must do so, do it well, do it fast, do it faster than anyone else. So we have various existing measures to protect ourselves and our systems, but we will need to evolve them in tandem with the changes in technology, media platforms, and communication channels. So Defense Minister Ng Eng Hen had announced digital defense as the sixth pillar of total defense yesterday to address the very real impact of cyber attacks. We will need to be better prepared as a society against such digital threats. Mr. Minister Iswaran will speak more about this at another event this morning. But let me say this as a former military men, we have learned one thing ever since we were young. And that is this phrase: terrain is neutral. Terrain is neutral. Whoever masters terrain better wins. So we should not look at the new cyber terrain as having only downsides. The cyber terrain, just as the physical terrain, is neutral. Whoever masters it wins. So with the greater digital threat, managing our resultant challenges to societal cohesion and stability will be even more critical. We know that Singapore's small size, openness, and relatively short history have always made it challenging for us to defend or mitigate the external influences on our systems. It is not practical nor possible for Singapore to shut our doors to the outside world. Our connectivity is our lifeline as a country. For a small country with no natural hinterland, it is most unnatural for it to be able to survive very long in the history of mankind. For small city-states without hinterland, it must connect to the world and leverage on the world as our hinterland. We must connect to the world to access resources and markets. But this is where it becomes interesting. In the past, connecting to the world to transcend one's geographical size, location, and limitation is only through the three physical dimensions of air, land, and sea. But today, in the new fourth non-physical dimension of cyberspace, small city-states like us have also the opportunity to transcend our previous physical limitations in terms of geography, geographical size, and geographical location. So again, excuse me, again, this reinforces in us the point. The new cyber terrain is both an opportunity for small city-states in particular, as well as a challenge. We have no intention to shut ourselves out from the rest of the world. That is not the way we will defend ourselves in this new cyber terrain. We will learn to operate in this new terrain, navigate this new terrain, and leverage on this new terrain for our own defenses. However, we need to be vigilant, watchful, but never fearful. Thus, our social and psychological defenses have become even more critical at this juncture of our history when combined with the digital terrain. In countering the challenges of external influences, Singaporeans must always start from the premise that whatever decision we must take collectively must be good for the Singapore's long-term interests. We have to remember each time and every time that only Singaporeans will decide our future and not allow anyone else to coerce or decide for us. In doing so, we can better look after each other in society, build up our resilience, and not allow forces to pull us apart. Whenever we are challenged, we must be prepared for the long haul and be ready to stand firm and united. When things happen, or when we are targeted, understanding the why all these things are happening is more critical than just understanding the what. Knowing why others are feeling in a certain way and why they are taking a certain course of action towards us is of utmost importance. And this is why platforms like APPSMO is so important to help us understand the whys and to check our own blind spots, that we do not just apply our logic to understanding other people's intent. through the greater interactions amongst the military and security officers, we learn to see things not just from our own perspective, but also that from other people's perspective. And if we can get an accurate read of other people's why, then we are less likely to misread the situation and apply the wrong response in return. This is the way that we can remain relevant and respond effectively. Hence, it is a challenge for our government to help our people to understand the reality of the geopolitics around us and the challenges that we face as a people, not just only in this point in time, but also across history. We are where we are because of our historical circumstances, and we should never forget that where we will go will also depend very much on what is happening around us beyond the shores of Singapore. And the danger for Singapore is, as we become more successful, we may unknowingly turn insular and start thinking that what happens here matters to our success as if it is the be-all and end-all. What matters in Singapore is certainly important, but what happens in Singapore cannot be divorced from what is happening elsewhere. And unless we keep a keen eye on what is happening elsewhere, we might be blindsided. We might be blindsided by our circumstances, no matter how well we do internally. So the total defense approach involves the entire nation. It is critical that we continue to strengthen ourselves, stay alert to the forces beyond Singapore, so that it becomes part of our DNA to be constantly alert to what is happening beyond Singapore. And we have seen generations of Singaporeans' families supporting their sons through national service. We know our people are striving hard to keep our multi-religious and multicultural social fabric intact. Our businesses are sharpening themselves to ensure that our economy remains relevant, vibrant, and competitive, and that we are never held ransom by any single market or single source for resources. Total defense has seen us through several crises, but we are never done with building total defense. I hope that generations to come will continue to hold on to this resolve to defend Singapore holistically across all dimensions of power. History has shown us that anything else can be dire. But for total defense to remain relevant, the 5 or 6 pillars today of total defense must not become dogma. We must continuously update the concept, find new opportunities to strengthen the concept, find new synergies across the different dimensions to bring about what we really want. A strong, coherent, united Singapore that can withstand the test of time, that can withstand the challenges emanating beyond the shores of Singapore. With those opening remarks, I'll be happy to have further discussions with you on this concept or any other topical issue that you might want to discuss today. Thank you very much, and may you have a good day ahead.